forever. You know, the events leading up to what we call Good Friday, the sacrifices of Christ started long before what we call Passion Week. And I've talked about this a lot on Sunday mornings. I've talked about this in Sunday school. None of this is new. But you know, the first major sacrifice that Jesus made for you is stepping out of heaven. You know, I know this isn't Christmas, but you can't really have Christmas or an Easter without Christmas. The first significant sacrifice, not the first significant thing that he ever did for you. He created all this for you. He did this long before this first significant sacrifice to become incarnate, to take on flesh, was a huge sacrifice. You realize before he came here, he didn't get tired. You know, he didn't have to sleep. He didn't have to do any of those things. I mean, he was just he was fully man, fully God. I mean, he was just, before he took on flesh. He just taking on flesh. You know, my flesh hurts a lot. The older I get, the more it hurts. Mornings, oh my goodness, mornings. Jesus never had a bad morning before he came here. He never had, he started his earthly ministry, what we call his earthly ministry, at about age 30. But I'll tell you what, I started feeling aches and pains at age 30. 40 was a little bit worse. 50 gets a little worse. I hear it just goes downhill from there. But Jesus just coming here, why would he do that? Why would Jesus come and put on flesh? And why would he do that? Especially knowing, we know that he was slain before the foundations of the earth was laid. What does that mean? When he willingly took on that flesh, he knew the end game. He knew why he came here. He willingly put on a flesh that he knew was going to be shredded to pieces at one time by his own creation that he loved so much to let them do it to him. So that's huge. I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine a world where I could just even lay in bed and say, Sue, go get me a cup of coffee. And poof, it happens. That world doesn't exist. Jesus' world was way cooler before that. Anything that he just willed or wanted, poof, it happened. He spoke things into existence. So he really limited himself by coming here in the very first place. Living a sinless life. I get that Jesus had a sinless nature. I get that. So you might say, well, that's kind of an unfair advantage he has there. I mean, he didn't have a sin nature like me. I mean, it was just easier for him. Was it easier for Adam? Adam had a sinless nature in the beginning. He didn't have to sin. It wasn't in him. It wasn't built in him. He chose to sin. Jesus could have. He could have taken the easy way out, but he wouldn't be Jesus. So he chose to live a life of sacrifice, a life where he never once sassed his mama, a life where he never once didn't listen to his daddy. I can't even imagine, Jesus as a teenager. I did not listen to my parents when I was a teenager. I was a sinful guy. Keep your mouth shut, Dan. Dan and I go back to high school years. Pastor Dan. But Jesus, his whole time here, he was preparing himself and he was living a life where he never once messed up. You realize if he ever once messed up, his sacrifice would have meant nothing. He wouldn't have been the blameless Lamb of God. He didn't mess up. That's a tough thing to do. That's a really hard thing to do. We talked recently because, when we see kind of his earthly ministry taking off, he gets baptized and goes out in the wilderness. We just recently talked about that. We talked about the fact he went 40 days and 40 nights fasting. And actually, if you think about it, it may have been just a tad bit longer because it was after 40 days and 40 nights when Satan came. Did all this happen in one day? I don't know. The Bible doesn't really clarify that. But he was willing to do without food. And I'm not kidding you. If I that's not even a joke. If I go 6 hours without eating, I get hangry. I would start sinning. I start sinning when I'm hangry. Jesus didn't do that. Jesus remained faithful to who he is. He remained faithful to the call that his Father had put on his life. He remained faithful because he knew the only way to rescue you and to ransom you was to never drop the ball. I wish I had a day I didn't drop the ball. I drop the ball every day. I don't have a PowerPoint right now. I drop the ball all the time. I'm sure we all do. But let's fast forward now. We don't have time to go through the entire life of Christ. Not tonight. Let's move into what we call Passion Week. Passion Week is that's what we call it. It's that week, kind of that leading up to the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. One of the first things in Passion Week that really gets my attention, first let's just talk about Christ. Was he kind of a social guy? Did he value people? He still does. Do you think he valued relationships? Do you think he valued friendships, especially close friendships? Well, what do we see in Passion Week? We see a time where Jesus is letting them know, I'm about to go. I'm about to hit the road. I'm getting ready to go to a place that you can't follow me. But he was teaching them still. He was still teaching them. In his last week, he was still teaching them servant leadership. And he washes their feet. But the thing that just blows my mind away about this, just the nature of Christ, just on washing feet in his context was slave work. He lowered himself to the very lowest place, the very lowest status that he could have taken in his context, in his time, in his place, by washing their feet. But there was somebody in there who he washed his feet that I definitely would not have washed his feet. Who was that? Judas. Do you realize Jesus knew? He knew what Judas had already done. He knew that Judas had already made the deal. He knew that he was about to betray him. He knew all of these things. That's a lot to say about Jesus. Would I wash Judas's feet? I wouldn't wash any of their feet. I'm sorry. Judas's feet? Absolutely not. How can you humble yourself to serve your betrayer in that way? I can't even wrap my head around it. But that's the nice academic thing to think about, the betrayal. Could you imagine how it felt? Remember Jesus, the guy that valued friendships, the guy that valued relationships, the guy that spent 3 years with this band of 12 fellas. I can't imagine how much it would hurt. The betrayal. I can't even wrap my head around that. All Jesus ever did for Judas was take care of him. All he ever did was put him in positions of trust. Do you realize that he was like the treasurer? He was the one that took care of the money. I'll tell you what, you got to have somebody you trust taking care of the money. But he knew, but he still did it anyway. Could you imagine the pain that would have caused him? The pain of the betrayal. I can't even wrap my head around it. But he still willingly subjected himself to that type of betrayal. And he still willingly subjected himself to that kind of emotional pain, again, because he didn't want to drop the ball, because he wanted to save you. It's huge. Huge, 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 huge. So then we have what we call the Last Supper. His last Passover meal, his last Seder. And actually, this is I'm putting together a nice little Seder kit here because next year I want to do a Seder. And I'm going to learn how to do it in Hebrew. I've started, and this is it. This is my start right here. But during that time, he was explaining what we're going to do later. He was breaking the bread and he was taking the cup and explaining to them that, this is my body that was broken. It's going to be broken for you. It's going to be ripped. It's going to be torn for you. This is the new covenant, my blood. This is the covenant that will always stand forever and ever. This is the covenant in my blood. The covenant that nobody could pluck you out of his hands because of this covenant in his blood. So that's a pretty huge thing. The sacrifices still keep going on. Gethsemane. After all this, what's he do? He goes out and wants to pray for a while. John chapter 17, we see these beautiful, what we call the high priestly prayers. He prays for himself, he prays for his disciples, he prays for us. Do you get that he even prays for you? He's about to be crucified, and he's still already thinking about you. He says, and Lord, bless those that believe that didn't even see. The ones that they didn't see me, but they still believe. Bless those. That's you and me. Christ was praying for you as he is facing imminent death. Sacrifice after sacrifice after sacrifice. This whole idea of sweating blood. I can't imagine the pressure Christ was under. Can't even wrap my head around it. I know this thing I was saying, but like I said, after this, I got to go to Manassas and put my very favorite pet. The euthanizer. And as each moment gets closer, I feel myself getting a little more stressed and a little more stressed and a little more stressed. It hurts just a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. I mean, sometimes I get a little bit of chest anxiety here, because I know what's coming. But it still does not compare to the stress that Christ was under, because he knew exactly what was coming down. He knew what was going down. To sweat blood, you have to be under so much stress that the capillaries in your flesh literally burst. I can't even wrap my head around it. Man, I've thought, man, this last year, it just kind of stunk in many ways. Loss, I had so much loss, had this, that, and the other, but I still have not felt so much stress and had so much heaviness. I've never once sweated a drop of blood. I can't even imagine what he was going through. Why was he doing that? Because of you. Because of you. Sweating blood. I can't even picture what that kind of stress looks like. Can't even wrap my head around that. But did he waver? No. Again, Christ did not want to imagine a heaven without you. He didn't want a heaven without you. So he continued to press forward under so much pressure, he was sweating blood. Well, then came the soldiers. This is all during this Passion Week. We're getting closer to this time of the sacrifice. Lots and lots of soldiers. We've talked about that in church. It wasn't just a few. It was a lot of soldiers. And then there was that Judas, the guy that he washed his feet, the guy that followed him around and learned under him for 3 years, kissed him to give him away. And you know one of the really cool things about Jesus being Jesus, There was something, I swear, I must have read it 1,000 times and didn't pick up on it, what it said. Have you ever done that? Have you ever even read something in the Bible where you've read it over and over and over and over and over and over and over, and it just didn't jump out at you exactly the magnitude of what this was? Do you realize when they went to take him, and we see this in John, they were all like, they were like knocked back. What was that? That's Jesus saying, you can't take me by force. I'm coming willingly. I'm coming willingly. All these soldiers, like I explained, it was probably right around the neighborhood of 1,000 of these guys. You're not going to take me unless I willingly give myself to you. Could you imagine? What else was going on? What about old Peter? We talk about that a lot because I like that part of the story. Pew! Takes off the ear of the servant of the high priest. Pew! Takes his ear off. Trying to kill him. He wasn't trying to take his ear off, I can tell you. What's Jesus do? Picks it up. Puts it back on. I wouldn't do that. I'd be like, sorry about your luck there, buddy. You're coming after me. I guess that's a small price to pay. I guess they're going to call you a lefty for a while. I don't know. But what it shows is still the compassion of Christ. The compassion of Christ in a time where I can't humanly begin to wrap my head around being compassionate. He was just sweating blood because he was so stressed. He was just kissed and betrayed by a close friend. And he's still worried about the guy coming to get him. Puts his ear back on. Can't wrap my head around that. So now they take Jesus off. Do you realize that he was being bounced back and forth between Pontius Pilate and Herod? Why was that? Why was he being questioned and tried so much that he was being bounced back and forth between the government and the Jewish leader, the king, Herod, and Pontius Pilate? Why? Because neither one of them could find any fault in this man. They're like, well, I ain't going to do nothing. You do something with him. He's your responsibility. He's a Jew. And Herod's like, well, it's Passover. I can't do anything with him. You do something with him. And this is like back and forth, back and forth. But where the rubber meets the road, they had no real charges on him. He's never done anything wrong. He never lied. He never hurt anybody. He never hurt anybody's feelings. It wasn't doing something really, really wrong. The only feelings I ever saw him hurt probably was the Pharisees. Oh, you brood of vipers. Well, no, it's because they were a brood of vipers. But in all of this, was he like, I'm sorry, guys. You're just going to have to let me go. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't do anything wrong here. What's your charge? What are you going to do? You can't hold me. Oh, I love that. If you don't have to be a cop very long before you hear somebody, oh, you can't hold me. You ain't got no rights to hold me. Jesus didn't defend himself. Didn't defend himself. Didn't open his mouth. His life over the last 33 years stood for itself. He never hid anything, especially that last 3 years. Never did anything that never hurt anyone. But something really, really interesting happened here. In fact, if you think about this is how hard Rome was trying to not do anything here. They're like, okay, it's customary for you guys. This time of the year, I'll let you pick 2 guys, and you decide who goes free, and you decide who I crucify, who I kill. Let the crowd decide. How in the world are they going to pick not pick Jesus to set go. So he picks the biggest, baddest guy that he can think, Barabbas. Who in the world could I compare Barabbas to? And how about, what's the crazy guy with the pentagram on his forehead? Charles Manson. Pilate picks Charles Manson or Jesus. Are you going to let Charles Manson go? Or are you going to let Jesus go? Who did they pick? Barabbas. Let the bad man go. You know, the Father had to intervene to allow that to happen. What's it say? That the devil then moved amongst the crowd and they started yelling what? Crucify him. Do you realize that the Father had not allowed that to happen? Satan could not have moved through the crowd and moved them in that way. So we even see the Father during this time sacrificing himself, allowing the accuser of man to accuse his Son. Everybody's paying high prices here. Everybody's paying high prices here. I can't picture what's going through the Father's mind through all this. I've always been very honest and blunt about the fact that if it was between one of my kids and everybody else, I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to pick my kids. I will. You know, as bad as that might sound, it's honest. I can't picture the Father standing by, watching all this, and picking me instead. It's almost like Barabbas and Jesus all over again. The Father had to pick between Jesus, his Son, or he had to pick me. Well, guess who he picked? Me. Guess who he picked? You. And you, and you, and you, and you, and you. I can go all the way through everybody in here. The Father picked you to set you free and let his Son pay that price. So there's a lot of the sacrifice. I am not trying to minimize the sacrifice of Christ. I cannot even begin to wrap my head around it. But it's even harder for me sometimes to wrap my head around the Father who could have just said, okay, I've had enough. I'm changing it. I get to write the rules. I'm going to change the rules. That would have been me as the dad. Okay, I'm just going to save everybody. You know, I'm going to save you. You're my son. I'm just going to say, okay, let's wipe everybody's debt clean. That's not the way it works. That's not the way a righteous God works. Because his righteousness, the Father's righteousness and his justice are so perfect that if he would just let it slide, he wouldn't be God. So somebody has to pay. The wages of sin is death. Death. So somebody's got to die in order for that kind of sin. That is how big our sin truly is. That the stupid stuff we do, the times we rebel against God, it is so big that somebody has to die. Somebody. And somebody did. That's why Good Friday, I just don't like it. Because he paid the price for me. So there's no way I could have paid it myself. But we haven't even gotten that far yet. So now the crowd's yelling, crucify him! Crucify him! And Pilate's like, you want to know what? This still blows me away. Mind you, I can show you tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of evidence that Pilate was very anti-Semitic. He didn't like Jews, but he was still trying to help Jesus out because he didn't do nothing. But he's saying, I wash my hands of this. He's done nothing. But if you want it, crucify him. Oh boy, did it just start. Things really started to ramp up there. Do you get what a cat of nine tails really is? When they said to have him flogged. A cat of nine tails. If you've ever seen the only depiction of what would be close to what it would look like, in my opinion, was actually in the Passion of the Christ. You know, you get these 9 straps, they got stuff in it so it rips your skin. And they pull it, and flesh comes ripping off the bones. 1. 2. And the whole time, Jesus would have been on a post with his hands secured in place. 3. 40 times. 40 times. In that time, that was a death penalty in itself. They would say, when they would say, you know, 40 lashes save one, the idea was, if it was a death, if you died, who really cares? But that's not really our intent. Because when they said 40, the intent was you were supposed to go down. Did it take Jesus down? No. And that's why these pictures that I've seen in Jesus over the years, we've all seen them. If you've grown up in church, you've seen the little sickly looking dude with the lamb. He's kind of pale and thin, and he's holding the cute little lamb. I'll tell you what, that guy wouldn't have taken 40 lashes with a cat of nine tails and kept on trucking. Jesus was a carpenter. He was probably a pretty big dude, if you think about it. He was a blue-collar worker up until he was 30, and he really kicked off at his ministry. He would have been a strong man. 40 lashes, and he keeps on going. Could he have stopped it at that point? He could have. The Bible tells us that he could command the angels of heaven and they would have rescued him. They would not have let his foot strike a stone. He had that ability. He could. But what else does the Bible say? That he was obedient, even to death. Even death on a cross. He kept trucking. Oh God, it just keeps going on. The mockery. Putting robes on him. Putting a crown of thorns on him. Do you realize the significance of the crown of thorns? When were thorns first here? Were they in the Garden of Eden? No. We see in the book of Genesis that part of the curse for our rebellion was that thorns would then spread out and do their thing. So the very thing that plucked his brow was connected with the curse. The curse of man for rebellion against God. Even that very thorn pierced his brow. We're not talking. Let me tell you about thorns. You know what? We had the other day, I guess it was 2 days ago, I was talking to Sandy at work. She was there. She was working for Middletown, and we were chatting a little. And they got a call from Frederick County that some guy ran across the interstate, and they wasn't sure if he went over on the school property, or the elementary school, or the college. So I'm driving through the woods. I get to the fence. Well, I decide I'm going to go across the fence and look for this dude on the other side. Well, there's thorns there. And I'm like trying to get across the fence, and they're like holding my leg. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what are these stinking thorns? And they're like pulling on me, and it's like they hurt. But they're little fellas. They're little guys. I got little scrapes. I got little boo-boos on my legs from these little tiny thorns. Jesus had those big old honking thorns. I'm like, you want to talk about an oucher? We're not talking about a boo-boo. We're talking about wounds. That's West Virginian for wound. Wounds. But he kept on trucking. They blindfolded him, punched him. Prophesy who hit you. Just mocking him. Mind you, this is occurring after his beating, his flogging. And this is after they put this crown of thorns on. They're still punching him. Prophesy who hit you. Are you the Son of God? Prophesy. Tell me who hit you. He could have called it off. He could have said, I had enough. Had enough. Had enough. He didn't. He was obedient to death, even death on the cross. Mind you, we haven't even gotten to the cross yet. I would have cried uncle long before that. Okay, Father. I know in my prayer a little while ago, I said, if you could take this cup from me, let your will be done and not mine. I would be thinking right now, okay, can I think that over again? Okay, how about my will now? Because I can't take this. That would be me. Why did Jesus continue? Because of you. Because of you. Because of me. I can't even wrap my head around it. You know, I've mentioned many, many times the passages in Isaiah that we don't see, you know, where the writers of the New Testament articulate it. But Isaiah, what he was seeing, this vision was very clear. He was very detailed about what he saw. What have I said in the past? What's one of the things that Isaiah saw? They ripped his beard out of his face. Let me tell you what. Have you ever gotten those little hairs in like your ear or on the edge of your nose? And you take those tweezers and you're like, woo! That's a little hair. Can't even wrap my head around that. Can't even wrap my head around that. The thing that Isaiah describes that tells me that it was so far worse than what even Mel Gibson pulled off on the Passion of the Christ is that he was beaten beyond the likeness of a man. He didn't even look human. Didn't even look human. He was beaten so badly. Why did he do that? Because of you. And because of me. That's why he did it. So now we're getting to the cross. So he has to carry part of the cross all the way up to Golgotha, where he would hang. So I can't even picture this image in my head of him trying to drag or carry this cross beam and people mocking him and just carrying on, and then he collapses. Let me tell you, I've heard people say, well, if he was all that tough, he wouldn't have needed help with that cross. Again, you wouldn't have gotten past the flogging. Until you get past the flogging, you don't have the right to say anything about Jesus needing help getting that cross beam the rest of the way up that hill. I don't know any man that would have gotten that far. I know a few women that may have. You tend to handle pain better than me. That's why you all have babies, not us. Because God knew that we weren't going to do it. The human race would end if I had to have the baby. But he finally had some help to get him to Golgotha. So they lay him down on this wooden cross. Have you ever seen pictures of Roman spikes? We're not talking about like the little things we hang pictures with. We're talking about a spike. and in his hands. Over and over and over until both of those hands were completely nailed to that cross. Same thing with his feet. Nails. Just to add to the humiliation, add to the pain, add to the agony. And you want to know what? That still wasn't the worst. Modern science tells us what Jesus died of. And the clue is actually in the Bible. After he was dead, I'm going to skip forward and come back. After he was dead, just to make sure that he was dead, they ran that spike up through his gut into his heart to make sure he was dead. And the Bible says what flowed? Blood and water. Well, we know, science knows, that when you die of asphyxiation, when you die of basically suffocation, you get this condition, and I don't remember the fancy word for it, but what happens is blood and water fills the pericardium, the sac that surrounds your heart. So when they pierced his heart and blood and water flowed, we now know that what finally killed him wasn't the nails, it wasn't the flogging, it wasn't all these things, it was asphyxiation. Why? He's on this cross. He's hanging like this. Every single breath, he'd have to pull himself up. This went on and on. Every single breath, he would have to pull up to catch his breath. I'm not asthmatic. But when I was a medic, I dealt with a lot of asthmatic people. And I'll tell you what, it looks scary. It looks scary if you have COPD or asthma and you can't catch your breath. It looks scary. It looks uncomfortable. It looks mean. After everything else that happened, he was now having to deal with not being able to even breathe. And that's what eventually took him. That wasn't even all they did to him. He was thirsty. What did they do? They gave him like this vinegar stuff, nasty stuff, to fulfill prophecy. There are a few things that Christ said from the cross that just blows my mind away. First of all, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? What was he actually saying? My Sunday school class probably knows this. He was quoting the Psalms. So even after all of this, because David said the very same thing. So even after all this, his mind was still on the Word of God. And he was still comforting himself with the Psalms of David. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? I can't picture not being a little ticked off at God if I would have been in that position. I'm telling you, I get mad at God way more than I should. But he's leaning into the Word of God to comfort himself in this time, in this moment. What's the one that really blows everybody away? I couldn't even imagine what it would have been like being at the foot of the cross to hear this. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. They know not what they do. Why don't they know what they were doing? What does Paul tell us? Our battle's not with flesh and blood. It's a spiritual battle. These folks that were doing all these things, they were caught up in a spiritual battle. And Jesus was the target. Forgive them. I haven't forgiven the sticker bush to put the boo-boos on my legs yet. I've thought about going out there and cutting that thing down. Couldn't imagine asking my Father in heaven to forgive somebody who did all of those things. What's the last thing he said? And this is very significant. It's not as like crazy as Father forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. It is finished. What was he saying? It is more than what you would picture in the English language. The English language, you're like, okay, it's done, and then he dies. It's not what he was saying. He was saying paid in full. What was he saying? Paid in full. What is that all about? Jesus was saying that he knew that he was about to die. And with that death, your sin was paid for in full. Not just some of your sin, not just the really not so bad sins. All of your sin was paid in full. It is finished. And then he gave up his spirit. It is finished. He's saying, Father, I've completed my work. Father, I've been the sinless lamb, and with my blood and my death, the work has been done. It's finished. Paid in full. Paid in full. You know what's really cool about that? I know we get so wrapped around the axle sometimes about for sins, not unrepentant, sins that we haven't said we were sorry for. God, please forgive me. You know, and I've even heard people say, it's like, oh Lord, I wonder if I'm going to have trouble getting into heaven if there was something that I did and I couldn't remember. Will it keep me out of heaven? No. Why? Because even if you don't remember it, you were paid in full. Sometimes I think we're almost like beggars groveling for forgiveness. You already have it. It's already there. Paid in full. So then they take down his body. And they lay him in a rich man's tomb. Jesus didn't have 2 cents to rub together at that point. But they put him in a rich man's tomb. Fortunately, a borrowed tomb. What are we going to do now? First of all, we're going to pray. We're going to pray a prayer of thanksgiving. That their sins are paid in full. We're going to pray a prayer of thanksgiving to the Father who made the way. We're going to pray a prayer of thanksgiving to the Son who took our place. We're going to pray a prayer of thanksgiving to the Holy Spirit that every single day works towards making me more like that Jesus. And then we're going to partake, and we're going to remember everything that we just talked about and understand that all of this was done for you. When you take the bread and you take the cup, you're remembering that this is the flesh that was ripped for me. This is the flesh that was probably left on the ground behind after the flogging. This is the flesh that may have been left behind in the cross as they drove those nails through his hands and his feet. We're going to remember that this is the blood that was pouring down off that cross. I can't even imagine what that cross looked like. You want to talk about a bloody mess? I can't even imagine. But that blood was shed for you. We're going to remember that thing. Let's pray, and then I'll explain